Well, that was a warm reception. Thank you so much for having me here. I am so excited to be here. I am tired, but I am excited to be here. I flew all the way from Australia, like a few of us in the audience, actually. So I've really got a very tight time to tell you about a lot of stuff. So I'm going to get right to it. So anyone who knows my work, we have done a lot of work where we looked at the effectiveness of different platforms, some of it controversial, some of you probably heard about that. But today is a little bit different. So some of you may know that one of our measures on top of STAS is also an attention score. But within that research, we've found a lot of I guess, insights around the concept of attention. I think he mentioned that we've just formed the Attention Council. So today's a little bit more interesting around, you know, the sorts of things that you can do, the art and science of attention, because it is that. So it's not specifically to television, but it definitely relates to all different platforms, so we'll get to it. So before I start though, for me as a tenured professor, it's important that we talk about the strength of the collection and the strength of the methodology before we get into the insights, so that you understand and you trust the rigour that sits behind it. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this, and then we can kind of go into some of the funner bits. So I still work with a university, but I also have a side business, and my business is essentially research technology. And the reason why I have a side business is because I became quite frustrated with traditional research measures. And over the last 4 years, we've built some technology to enable passive collection of data. So rather than asking people intention and recall, we actually collect passively a number of variables, but also at scale. So we collect single source data with an attention score and also a virtual store to understand sort of the nuances of different platforms. So let me just give you a bit of a background. So in a nutshell, the way that we collect it is we have an app that there's a whole bunch of architecture that sits behind it, but essentially you would download our app and we do it on all devices. So we do it on mobile, which is our principal one we use, but television as well, I'll get to that in a minute, tablet and PC. So you download our app. Essentially what the app does is it will send you to your Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, BVOD platforms, wherever your test platform is. And during that experience, so you log in as yourself, so it's a real interface, it's not a fake portal, but the code that sits behind our app enables us to be able to interject test ads. So the important part about that is that we can actually control for what you see without you really knowing across platforms. So we might have groups that are Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, but the groups actually see the same content. And that's really important because content does actually make quite a difference to the nature of attention and also obviously other behavioural outcomes. So you download our app, we send you to Facebook, for example, we interject with test ads, but we also, during that time, it switches on the camera. I will say it's all done with double opt-in privacy, and we don't scrape unique or private information. But the camera runs, I think it's essentially around about 5 frames per second. So essentially it's taking, in a crude way, facial footage at 5 frames per second. So we are watching you interact with the platform. On top of that, we can tell, because the JavaScript that sits behind the ad, we can tell how fast you're scrolling. We have orientation, so we can tell if you've moved it into horizontal orientation. We can tell the pixels on screen. We can tell how much spatial clutter there is, because we can tell how big the ad is relative to the screen size. And we can also do in the wild, which means rather than us intercepting with test ads, we can actually test our same systems using ads that you were supposed to see from a targeted perspective. Then we send you to a virtual store. So if anyone understands discrete choice, it's essentially this forum where you're asked to make some choices from some shelves, in essence. And what that does is it doesn't ask you whether you intend to buy, it just kind of represents familiarity. And we'll get to that a little bit later as well. Then all this data is pushed to our stack. The facial footage is then transposed to an attention score, and it's connected on an individual level to what you saw, how much how many pixels on screen, how fast you scrolled, which ads you saw, and what you bought. But what I will say, which is really important, is we also collect 3 different types of attention. And we did this, we're all ex-university PhDs, so we did it based on what literature tells us to collect. So we collect whether you're not looking at all, whether you're looking at the screen and not looking at the ad, or whether you're looking at the ad directly on the screen. So there's this kind of non-viewing, there's directly looking at the ad, and there's this thing called passive. Okay, so that's a really important point because we're going to talk about that a little bit. So we've done a lot of studies over the last 3 to 4 years, and the beauty of this kind of platform for us is that we can be in any one country concurrently at any time, so there's no hardware, it's passive, so we're enjoying it. So that is the background, and you know, our philosophy is rigor. So if you ever want to ask me any questions about how we do it, I'm completely transparent. We've written papers about it. So the fun bit, what have we learned from this in the last few years? Firstly, that attention in the age of distraction is not the focused version that marketers idealise. So most marketers think that if you design an ad or create an ad that is beautiful or well built, that you're likely to stop everything you're doing and just focus directly on it. And that's actually wrong. And we'll get to that in a minute. But the reality is we live in complete overload, and everyone knows this. And we do have a finite capacity to process things. So we filter out, as a consequence, we filter out things that are largely not relevant. And I often call it, we kind of operate in a state of zombie, because we're kind of walking around, not really, until there are potentially triggers that jump us in and out of this cognitive state. So this means we live in this perpetual state of subconsciousness. And, you know, with respect, advertising's the least on our minds when we live in a state of busyness. Sorry to say. So what happens is, and this comes, obviously there's literature that sits well behind this, but we take decision shortcuts to cope. So we fill in the blanks, if you like. This is called satisficing, when decisions are based on good enough just to avoid overwhelm. So, you know, if you actually think about your own life, that's kind of what we do. We don't need all the information, just get to the facts, please, and we make some decisions. So that's how we operate in general. So what this means is that because advertising is not a high priority, we kind of switch in and out of focus. You know, we're not just going to go, oh, we'll watch an ad and we'll watch it for the next 8 seconds. We tend to switch in and out of focus. So most marketers have the wrong notion of how attention works. And that's okay, because there are things that you can do at the different points of high attention triggers. But just be wary that attention, as you would expect, is not necessarily directly looking at your ad for the entire duration of the creative. So what we do know is that guidance triggers can jumpstart attention, even if it's only momentarily. So the trick is to understand what those moments are likely to be, but also what you do at those moments to ensure that at least there could potentially be a behavioural outcome at the other end. So again, this comes from the psychology literature. So there are 2 types. So there's top-down triggers, which means that things that are of personal relevance are likely to get you to stop and look at something. So obviously, if you're in the category to buy, you are more likely to notice the ad that's on screen. Or if you are actively looking for something, you're in the market for something and you go searching for something online, you're more likely to look at the ads surrounding that content. But the other thing that's more interesting, so that's hard. I mean, we just talked about addressable, and we're getting there with that. But generally speaking, that's hard to understand. What is relevant to you is quite likely different to that's relevant to me. So the other thing that's interesting is that bottom-up triggers deliver opportunities to kind of get an attention spike as well. And what we mean by bottom-up triggers is that it's unexpected. You weren't looking for it, it's not relevant, it's just something that stops you in your tracks, and you pay what we call automatic and unintended attention. So you weren't trying to watch it, but you were glued to it. It's a bit like, these are the classic examples, when someone's in a room and they mention your name, all of a sudden you listen to their conversation, whereas you weren't before. If you are driving along and there's a siren, you kind of are looking around for it because you're cognitive of what's happening around. So those types of things. So what I will say as well is if you can't see the ad, it doesn't matter. Guidance triggers don't matter. So anyone who knows my work from the last couple of years, I've been working with some great partners, including Dentsu and Think TV, around the importance of ad visibility. So guidance triggers aren't going to work if there is not an opportunity for the ad to be on screen. So bearing in mind with our technology, we can collect pixels, which obviously is proportion of the ad that is on screen, but also this other very related construct, which is coverage. So it's about the amount of spatial clutter that sits around that. So proportion of the screen that the ad covers. So just remember those two measures. So by the nature of the JavaScript that sits behind our code, we can collect for that. What we do know, without a doubt, and I won't go into all the detail, is pixels matter a lot to attention and brand choice. So attention increases with the higher proportion of pixels. I often stand here and think, I'm a bit embarrassed because that's really no shit, Sherlock. If you can't see the ad, then you can't pay attention to it. So, you know, I'm a big advocate for 100% pixels on screen, and I'm a true believer, and we can see it in our data, that anything below 100% pixels on screen, there's a diminished effect, and it's quite considerable work. So do ask me if you want to see the backstory behind that. So, I mean, I understand the MRC's position, line in the sand, but anything below 100% is diminished. And that's why we're at the future of TV, because TV is 100% pixels 100% of the time. So screen coverage also matters, but obviously the two are very related, because the more of the ad that's on screen, the more likely it is that it'll be larger on screen, okay? So the relationship between coverage and attention, coverage and brand choice is really important as well. So that's I call that a visibility. So I don't use the word viewability, and viewability is just truly pixels on screen and also time. I talk about visibility as a trilogy. So it's no surprise that attention varies considerably between platforms. Why, people? Because ad visibility differs significantly by platform. And we all know that, and that's not what we're here to talk about. Again, there's a whole presentation on that and what that really means. But do think about that, that if you are looking to be able to drive attention and behavioural outcomes, but you have a visibility issue, you're less likely to get there. And low visibility can be the difference, and this is quite often, and we'll get to this in a minute, the reason why the low visibility struggles with a behavioural outcome, because it can be the difference between seeing the brand or not. So if you've got, I mean, you can see the examples there. So often people typically, to this day, use the brand in the bottom right-hand corner because they don't want to interfere with the story of the ad. But quite often, what it will mean is if your pixels are lower on screen, it'll just not be on the brand itself won't be present, and that makes a big difference. Time on screen helps too, but with diminishing returns. So we see in our data that pixels on screen means more. Time's important, but not as important as being seen, full stop. And the interesting thing with time as well is each platform fosters a particular amount of time by the nature of its modality. So you can't expect to be able to play a seriously long ad on a social platform where on average the time spent viewing is lower. You can't, you know, there's nothing you can do. So unexpectedness triggers attention, which we talked about kind of earlier before. Now, this particular professor, who is actually ex-Harvard Med, but he now resides in Melbourne, which is up a bit from me. If you ever want to truly and completely grab an individual's attention, then you must break their prediction. So this bloke is a lot better than I. He studies how to improve youth's memory. So his whole thesis is around education and improving children's education by nature of learning how the brain works and how they process and trying to help them learn for tests. I mean, that's a better job. So I've got his book written in here in a minute. You should take a photo and grab it. But his whole premise is that when a prediction fails, the brain becomes primed to take in and hold on to this new information. Okay, so he often talks about things like, and association is there as well. So he often talks about, if you were just yapping away on the couch and you were, all of a sudden there was no sound on the television and the screen was completely blank, you would go, what's going on? That's not what should happen. So breaking a prediction can be an amazing way to trigger attention because people weren't expecting that. So he also talks about things like, that's why if you miscount the amount of stairs that you in the middle of the night you'll fall, even though you've done that route 1,000 million times. So this kind of thing, so you wouldn't expect that. I used to have a picture up there of Bert and Ernie, but no one really got it. I just find that, that's breaking predictions, so it should be an orange, but it's an onion. So do definitely get this book because it really does give you some practical tips about bottom-up triggers. So what we see in our data is that emotion acts as an unexpectedness trigger. Excellent. Got your attention. I got my attention there too, because I hadn't seen that before. Emotion is an unexpectedness trigger. So this is actually work that I did when I was still working for Ehrenberg Bass Institute a few years back. But the way that we operationalise emotion is through an arousal valence grid, which is well published, and I can send you those things. But essentially we look at emotions in a way where you have high arousal emotions, which are emotions that kind of cause a physiological response, so crying, gasping for breath, nervousness, goosebumps, laughter. Did I say laughter already? And then low arousal, which is the pair. So these are actually arousal pairs. So hilarity is the high arousal version, or the physiological version that makes you laugh out loud, but amusement's more, doesn't really do much. So high arousal, low arousal pairs, and then we also plop them into positive and negative valence. So this is how we operationalise emotions when we're doing emotions coding, and we've had much success with that framework. So what we do know is that high arousal content is long noted to drive behavioural outcomes, and it's no different to more recent sort of work that we've done. So the earlier work that I did was around sharing. So at the time I wrote a book around viral content, and it was that emotions obviously drove sharing, forwarding sharing, but there's also brand favourability and email forwarding and all sorts of things. But we also see, using the same construct, that high arousal content drives more attention and brand choice than low arousal content. And again, I feel like that's a bit of a no shit Sherlock moment, but it's actually quite interesting that the prevalence of high arousal is low. And that's because it's hard to be universally funny, and you become quite desensitized. So once you've seen it once, it's not funny the second time. So one thing I will say is that many people think that creative devices are an unexpectedness trigger. So if you just put a cute puppy or a baby or any of those types of things into your content, that's likely to cause someone to go, oh, that's interesting and unexpected. But the reality is some animals are actually boring. That creative devices are only drive attention when it's directly linked to arousal. So you can have a cute dog sitting in the corner, but then this dog over here that's doing tricks is another level. So just be mindful that the tactics that you use, it's less about the talent and more about the emotional trigger that it kind of evokes. We also find that sound is a promising bottom-up trigger. So we have just done a whole bunch of work with Dentsu Global, and the early results are positive, that attention and sound is related. And again, I think that's what we would have expected. However, it is hard to generalise at the moment because guess what? The majority of platforms is auto sound off. So we have to get more and more data. So we believe in generalisation. So just because one set of data has some promising results doesn't necessarily mean that it's generalisable across all different conditions. So do watch this space. They were doing some more in that space. So what I will say is attention and brand choice are cousins, not siblings, right? So just because you get attention doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to cause massive movement. You're going to race to the store right this very minute and go and buy it, okay? So there's a relationship, but it's not perfectly linear. They're cousins, not siblings. So we see that attention spikes are triggered by this concept of unexpectedness, but it's not necessarily always translated to a sale. Now this is really important because advertising A is not persuasive. So I know that Magda is speaking afterwards, and I think Weema is speaking. So there's this whole, rules around the nature of brand growth and how advertising actually just nudges existing propensities. It's not a persuasive force because most ads fail to link the ad to the brand at all, particularly at the attention points. So I showed you before how people kind of dip in and out of attention, but when this is a high attention critical moment, obviously it's an Australian ad because there's not too many koalas in London, but you don't even, what category is that, let alone what brand that is. And so when we tested using our technology to understand the attention triggers, this was by far the most viewed moment in a very, very long television ad, of which they then adjusted it and have kind of improved it. But you don't even know what category it is, let alone brand. So it is actually for a major insurance brand in Australia, not the US, I forget where I am half the time. So we find that mere presence of branding at attention peaks increases the chance of buying. So these are things, and these are layers that you can apply to help those moments. So I often get questioned around, well, that's a bit rude that you put your brand smack bang in the middle of the most attentive point. Well, the reality is if you don't, it's likely to be misattributed to the larger competitor. So take your pick. So sales are amplified when attention peaks and branding are aligned, and we see that consistently, right? So a couple of little extra findings which are a bit fun on the branding code side, because we also have we build an annotator, so rather than human coding, the whole point of our existence is to reduce human bias in research. So we built an annotator which essentially enables us to understand how big a brand is, how frequently it plays, the duration, et cetera, rather than getting some poor student to sit there and do it as part of his honours. So we do see that brand size matters. So high performing ads show the brand twice the size. And what's interesting about that is that's obviously even more prevalent for mobile. So many creatives fail to increase the proportion of the ad in a mobile campaign, yet the mobile screen's about 100th of the size of TV. But we also get people that say, will it put people off if the brand is present at those high attention points? Some of the earlier work that I've done shows that absolutely not. It makes no difference at all to forwarding behaviour or to extra attention. We also see that brand duration matters. So the high-performing ads showed the brand twice as long on screen. And when you think about it, that makes sense because you dip in and out of attention constantly. And early brand matters, obviously, given the platforms that you might choose in the online space, you'd be lucky to get 3 or 4 or 5 seconds. Early branding is really important. So I want you to say this with me, people, because our brains are trained to satisfy us. This means when the brand is, thank you. So the attention you work so hard for will likely benefit your larger competitor, and that is without a doubt what's going to happen. So we fill in the blanks, which comes from all the psychology literature, when we don't have all the information. Like, oh, that ad's for Pepsi. No, it's for Coke. Or the other way around. So I actually kind of say, even though we're a platform effectiveness research company, essentially we see that the importance of quality branding, and it's perhaps one of the most underrated variables of success. Some good news, there is high value in low attention. So don't feel too bad if you don't have a really, really high attention score and someone sat there for the whole time and fixated on it. And this work we've just completed with Dentsu Global. It was released earlier this year as part of their attention economy initiative. But what we can actually see is that greatest uplift in sales impact occurs when a viewer goes from no attention whatsoever and then pays some sort of passive attention. So just for example, with the TV and how it works, we actually have hardware that sits in front of the television that projects programming onto the screen, soon to be live TV, I might add, and we still take our facial footage. So we can tell if someone is in earshot, if they're on the couch not looking, or if they're out of the room completely. But what we see quite consistently is that passive viewing does play quite a significant role. And that makes sense, right? Because if you think about your peripheral, you do sort of take things in. Now, obviously, high attention or direct attention is more impactful, but in terms of the greatest impact, it comes to passive. So it's essentially even when we don't notice, we notice. Now I'm going to show you a quick video. I promise it's super quick to show you to demonstrate my point.
Oh my God. There's nothing you can do about it because you don't even realise it's happening.
It's just scary. Do you want to just leave that envelope there, by the way? Here's your menu. Give you a couple of minutes, all right?
2 for a calamari.
What are you thinking? Triple dip chicken.
Triple dipped.
Triple
dipped chicken, please.
This envelope was given to you before you made your choice, right? Yeah.
Are you being for real? Oh my God.
That's just crazy.
There was other things that I wanted on this menu.
That's so weird. How did you do that?
I just want to know how.
I've seen that.
Dr. Alex, the guy from Love Island.
Yesterday, I saw this on my feed. I was thinking he's a doctor, but he's eating greasy food.
It's Anton. I saw that when I looked on his thing as well.
Big smile afterwards, and that was delicious.
Oh, wow.
Scroll right past, didn't even like it, but that is so weird.
Hello. Triple dip chicken, you can't resist.
Oh, wow.
I didn't even notice that.
That's crazy.
I didn't notice that on the seats, actually. I'm not going to lie to you. I remember like, the colours more so than the actual thing on it.
Oh, yeah. I didn't even notice. That was on the wall as well.
I can't remember it.
I don't remember that.
It really is, like, subconsciously.
Yeah, playing tricks in your mind.
I suppose it already does influence you then, doesn't it? I think this method of marketing in the food industry is wrong.
So the point of that... Sorry, was that funny? The point of that video was actually, it was a small sample, but the actual point of the video was how not to influence our youth to eat badly. Again, another job that's well worth the weight in gold. But the point is that passive attention works, which is the point at which I wanted to show you. So this is where distinctive assets or branding becomes even more important because, you know, they might not directly look at it, but if the asset was shown, and obviously the more well-known that asset is, the greater the opportunity for it to have some sort of effect. And that was kind of the point of the video. So make it easy to recognise the brand, particularly given we live in a state of zombie or a divided attention state. So my last little point is that none of this matters if the oppression's not human. Again, it's a bit of a no shit Sherlock moment. The ad fraud problem is actually larger than you think. So if you can follow, here's the funniest man in the entire world, Dr. Augustine Fu. And he's the nicest person. He's based in New York, but his speciality is cybercrime, but also ad fraud. So some of his work is quite controversial and a little bit like you want to kill yourself because it's quite sort of, you know, I shouldn't have said that. You probably want to change jobs. But he talks about the incredible nature of fraud in our digital ecosystem. So, and there's a few there alone, and I know the WFA are looking at it. But that's where television essentially still has the upper hand because we are not seeing that level, obviously, in the TV space. So when I talk about attention, I talk about the impressions that are, today's currency is based on an incomparable and diluted measure. And so when many are not human, start with, or not seen from a viewability perspective, our trading currency is failing advertisers. So we talk about quality CPMs as being a good way forward, and there's a few organisations that are going in that manner, but only when the queue is real. So quality is not click-through rates, quality is human, audible, viewable, potentially duration weighted. So do look around for that. So I look at attentive reach as a layered construct that you need them all together for it to be functional. So if it's only ad visibility and attention and not quality branding, it will be misattributed to the competitor. If you only have ad visibility and quality branding, there's no attention trigger, so there'll be limited cut through. If you only have quality branding and an attention trigger, but it's not visible, you're not going to have any attention or be noticed. And then my last point is if there's no human, there's no point. So presence is a really vital thing. So this is where the attention economy makes sense and will change the game in the future. And there are a couple of amazing organisations that are investing in reform, not just commercial outcomes, but reform. So do look for these people. Oh, I have a book coming out and it's in print now, so I'm pretty excited. So I'll be back in the UK in early March to promote it. So all of this work's in there, plus some futurists, which I won't reveal who they are, but they're pretty funny and pretty high profile. So do remember this simple truth: in an attention economy, not all reach is equal. Thanks, guys.